He was just Dad. In a way, he's always been just my father.
Dad was Harold Adrian Russell Philby, better known to the world as Kim. An Englishman who spied for the Soviet Union.
I remember him as clear as day, just with his sort of stuttering and, sort of a real English, sort of Oxford, Cambridge type,
He had everything really going for him. It was a shame that he did what he did, but there it was.
The last time I spoke to a communist, knowing him to be a communist, was sometime in 1934.
It was a lie. On a stormy night in Beirut, a double life that had lasted 30 years ended when he defected to Russia.
He was one of the worst traitors in history.
For the rest of his life, he lived among a people whose language he never mastered, while his countrymen counted the cost of trusting him with their secrets.
It infected the whole British intelligence establishment with the paranoia. I mean, if Philby, good old Kim, could have been a spy, any of us could have been.
Scores of books have been written about what Philby did, but the man inside remains elusive.
He was just like two different people, really, in one body. It was strange.
For the investigative writer Philip Knightley, Philby's defection was the start of a long pursuit.
These are the Philby letters, aren't they?
These are the Philby letters.
How many were there, roughly? I mean, how many years did you say you talked to him?
20 years, yes. Your letter from India took 6 weeks to reach me, so the chance of a casual drink presented itself too late. However, if you're still interested, I think there's a fair possibility of us getting together for a real talk in a not-too-distant future. That's how it all started.
Knightley took up Philby's invitation to meet him. A room had been reserved for him by the KGB.
Then the phone rang and a voice said, "Knightley?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Philby here." I could hardly believe it. He said, "Do you want to start work straight away and come around for a drink? And we'll meet tomorrow." And I said, "Straight away, Mr. Philby, straight away." He said, "A neighbor of mine will pick you up." Well, the neighbor turned out to be his KGB binder, his KGB gopher. And he drove me to a small block of flats in a nice garden. And we went up the lift to Philby's door. And the door opened and there was Philby. A smaller, less impressive figure than I thought, because slightly stooped, carpet slippers, looking very much at home. An Englishman receiving a visitor in his drawing room.
Philby's journey to that flat in Moscow had started here in Cambridge. The contrast between the gilded lives around him and the harsh world outside drove him towards left-wing politics. The great fear then was the rise of fascists all over Europe. The question was, what could people like him do about it?
He was very lucky in that his father, St. John Philby, gave him £50, which in those days was quite a lot of money. And he immediately, with that money, bought himself a motorcycle and took a train all the way to Vienna.
He got there just in time to witness the brutal suppression of local socialists by the Austrian fascists.
Nazis just reintroduced beheading for political offences, and they collared one political dissident to the gallows on a chair because he had already been wounded. These sort of things had, for a young man, had a very powerful impression.
And so did this woman, Alice or Litzy Friedman. She was a young, worldly wise divorcee who was fighting fascism on the ground. Philby fell in love almost as soon as he met her. He gave her his volume of Shelley's poems, and in return got a lesson in the realities of an unprivileged life.
She really took him in hand. She was 2 years older than he was, and they went eventually and lived in a very small flat. They had practically no money, but they worked hard to protect the working class against this right-wing coup.
After Philby defected, Patrick Seal wrote a book about him. Evidence of his early political views wasn't hard to find.
Oh, God. This is the fruit of the research into that book. And it's a mass of stuff in there. In these many years since I looked in here, there's a colossal amount of stuff here.
One source was a journalist called Eric Geddy, who met the young Philby frequently during those hectic weeks.
Kim came to see him and was desperate, I think, for suits to take to the poor socialists who were running for their lives. Geddy was alarmed at what was happening there, the fact that the working class had been absolutely sort of savagely contained and crushed by the fascists.
After a short and passionate affair, Kim married Litzy.
Harold Adrian Russell Philby, married to Alice, that's Litzy Friedman, Mosaic Jew.
To escape the Nazis, the newlyweds came to London. Here in Regent's Park, Philby had the meeting that would change his life. A friend of Litzy's, another Austrian Jew called Edith, had brought him here to meet a resident Soviet agent, codenamed Otto. Otto's advice was not what he expected. Don't join the Communist Party, he said. Create a cover story for yourself and get inside Britain's ruling establishment.
They advised him very strongly to give up communism, to give up left-wing views and pretend to be a rightist, which he did, of course. He even went and made friends with the German embassy and broke completely with all his left-wing friends.
His great love became the collateral cost of his new mission. He didn't actually divorce her until after the war. By then, he had 3 children by a respectable Englishwoman called Aileen Furze and was safely installed at the heart of British intelligence.
Nobody seemed interested in the fact that he was once married to a communist, had a background of belief in communism, been active in left-wing politics in university. It was just glossed over.
There was something about Philby which inspired confidence. He seemed like an archetypal, honest Englishman.
4 other Cambridge students with impeccable backgrounds started spying for the Soviets at the same time. 2 of them, Guy Burgess and Donald MacLean, were good friends of Philby's. Guided by the KGB, they all worked their way into government jobs, passing so many wartime secrets to Moscow that the Russians could scarcely believe they were genuine. But the end of the war plunged them into a dangerous new world. In 1949, Philby had been sent by MI6 to Washington. His job was the top-secret point of liaison between British and American intelligence. It was a big step up. People even spoke of him becoming the next head of MI6. The only cloud on his sunny horizon was his friend Guy Burgess, whom he'd rather incautiously invited to stay. Burgess, homosexual and louche, scandalized the locals. And there was worse to come.
This is the BBC Home Service, and here is the news. The Foreign Secretary made his expected statement in Parliament today about the disappearance of the two Foreign Office officials, Mr. Maclean and Mr. Burgess.
No longer was Uncle Joe an ally of the West. To spy for the communists was the worst of sins. In the anonymous buildings near Parliament where MI6 was housed, there was consternation. Unknown to the public, Maclean was about to be interrogated because of evidence supplied by the FBI. Someone had obviously tipped him off. The finger of suspicion pointed at their bright young star in Washington.
Philby was recalled immediately upon the defection. He travelled back to London. As soon as he arrived, he was taken to MI5's headquarters.
Waiting for him was a team of interrogators led by Dick White, the rising talent of the counter-espionage service.
The trump card for MI5 was to produce Litzy Friedman's passport, showed it to him, and it was covered with stamps of her travels on the continent. And he was asked, if you were living on £2 a week, how could she afford to travel around the continent in this way? And Philby was absolutely poleaxed by that, and he had no reply.
But it wasn't a knockout blow.
They tried to get a confession from him by having him interrogated by Buster Milmo, you see. And Philby proved more than a match for Milmo, adopting a technique that he later told me he'd adopted frequently in these matters. When asked to explain something that looked really suspicious, he would just say, "It's interesting, I can't explain that. It's very, very..." and go no further.
MI5 thought he was guilty, and Philby had to resign from his job. But some colleagues in MI6 weren't so sure.
It sort of split six. He had his friends who felt he's been badly done by, and he had those who were absolutely convinced that he was guilty. And being British, it was not resolved. It was swept under the carpet.
Philby found himself in limbo. No job with MI6 and no contact with his friends in the KGB. He brought his wife and now 5 children down to the sleepy Sussex town of Crowborough and tried without much success to get work.
Dad was all over the place. He worked in Mallorca, he worked in Ireland. We never knew really what he was doing. I sort of slightly assumed. You don't question it as children that he might have been some sort of rep. I think people helped him, you know, gave him the odd job or two because he wasn't really employable.
They rented a large Victorian house, shielded from the road by trees. But the unresolved question didn't go away.
Suddenly, Dad was in the news. He was on the paper. This is the third man.
The man behind this headline was J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI. He was so furious that Philby had got off scot-free that he deliberately leaked information to a journalist. But the plot backfired. Foreign Secretary Harold Macmillan was asked a question about it in Parliament, and with no proof that would stand up in court, he had no option but to clear Philby. This is what he said.
There was no reason to conclude that he had, at any time, betrayed the interests of Britain, or to identify him with the so-called third man, if there was one.
Philby immediately invited the world's press to join him at his mother's flat in Kensington.
Mr. Harold Philby, on the right, holds a press conference to deny charges that he was involved in the disappearance of Burgess and Maclean.
Mr. Philby, Mr. Macmillan, the Foreign Secretary, said there was no evidence that you were the so-called third man who allegedly tipped off Burgess and Maclean. Are you satisfied with that clearance that he gave you?
Yes, I am.
Well, if there was a third man, were you in fact the third man?
No, I was not.
I think Mum was always worried She said to her best friend once, "I'm terrified Kim's going to go to Moscow or Russia and take John and Joe."
I was asked to resign from the Foreign Office because of an imprudent association with Burgess, and as a result of his disappearance. So, beyond that, I'm afraid I've got no further comment to make.
So do you mean she knew he was a spy?
I really don't know. I think she probably suspected. He'd been accused. I mean, you know, Burgess had been living with us. It must be very difficult not to know, although he was very, very good. He obviously was excellent because he got away with all the questioning by all the sort of authorities and came out of it.
The last time I spoke to a communist, knowing him to be a communist, was sometime in 1934.
Just what a whopper that was. Very few people knew at that stage. The whisper put around was that Philby had been a middle-rank civil servant of no great importance. Then Knightley came across a book by a former secret agent writing under the name of John Whitwell.
Oh, here we are.
So you discovered this book?
Yeah. Here we are, British agent. And of course we quickly found out from the publishers that John Whitwell was a pseudonym, both a Secret Service pseudonym and author's one as well. And his real name was Leslie Nicholson. His publisher eventually agreed to give us his private address, which was above a cafe in East End of London. I went down to see him. Very pathetic case. Like so many people who have been in the Secret Services, he was in bitter dispute over his pension rights, and he felt that he'd been diddled over his pension. He was living in very straitened circumstances. And then I realized, of course, that all I had to do was tell him what his life used to be like when he was on expenses. Towards the end of this very boozy 4-hour lunch, he said, "Philip, I'm a bit surprised at how little you know about Philby. Don't you know what Philby's job was in the Secret Service?" And I said, "Well, we haven't got that far yet." He said he was in charge of the anti-Soviet section. The anti-Soviet section of the British intelligence was in the hands of a Soviet agent.
But instead of jail, Lucky Kim found himself in what was then called the Paris of the Middle East. This strange twist in his fortunes happened because some people in MI6 couldn't bring themselves to believe that he had betrayed them.
They went along to David Astor of The Observer and the editor of The Economist, and they said this man has been grossly wronged by the establishment and he should be looked after. And they found him work. So his period of treachery was extended by years.
So they found him work not only as a journalist, but as a spy?
Yes.
Astonishing, really, isn't it?
Yes, it is astonishing. But then it's an astonishing world.
Dick Beeston was then Middle East correspondent for the News Chronicle. Dick and his wife Moira befriended Philby when he arrived. They noticed he drank too much, but his charm was undeniable.
He had this stammer which people found rather attractive in a way. We would sort of try to help him out with his words. But it was actually his good manners and his charm which went down very well indeed during the time that he was sober.
In those days, the British Embassy in Beirut was housed in something called the Spears Building. Even today, the electricity bills come in their name. MI6, or the Friends as they were called, operated from here, up on the 4th floor. The whole building is being redeveloped as flats now. But after the 1956 Suez crisis, it became the hub of a vast intelligence web covering the whole region.
It was very much a centre. There were a lot of sort of CIA people buzzing around the place, and quite a lot of British intelligence people, mostly based on the embassy there.
Did you know who was who?
Yes, more or less we did, yes. There was a man called Paul Paulson, who was the head of the MI6 operation in Beirut, who actually had been at school with Kim Philby at Westminster.
One of the embassy insiders was John Julius Norwich. Diplomacy, like spying, was still very much a gentleman's game.
This is the main embassy team after the new ambassador, more Crosswaite, had presented his credentials.
Which one's the ambassador?
He's the one in the middle here. Myself, Max Pirotti, our consul, Alec Brodie, our military attaché, Paul Paulson, he was the head of MI6 in the embassy, and John Selwyn, who is, I see, also in uniform with an enormous display of medals. I cannot exactly remember what he did.
In the summer heat, embassy staff were allowed to flee to the hills every afternoon. The custom in those days was to drink before you drove.
Next to the British Embassy, there was a very pleasant little establishment called Joe's Bar. And several of us used to congregate in Joe's Bar at 1 o'clock in order to have a couple of stiff ones to help us drive up the mountain for lunch.
There was Paul Paulson and John Julius Norwich and the Colonel Brodie, the military attaché. It was quite an amusing little group of people.
So more of a sort of spooks bar, was it?
Yeah.
In 1975, the streets around the embassy were overwhelmed by civil war. In the shadow of those scarred buildings, I found someone who remembered where the bar had once been.
Just here in front of you, here, that door, is still closed from the 1975. 1975, still closed. Nobody can cross here. They crossed quickly. The snipers was all the way.
And what was Joe's bar like? Was it a nice bar?
Yeah, it has a tradition, you know. He has many friends.
It became one of Philby's favorite drinking dens.
Over there, that yellow building behind the trees is the British Embassy. They just stepped down here to the bar.
You went in, there was the bar on your right. There was a window not more than 12, 15 feet across. And that had 2 or 3 little tables, one of which was Kim, who was part of the furniture. I mean, I was never there when he wasn't there.
And in what state was he?
Speechless. I mean, perhaps he could speak, but he didn't speak. I mean, you said hello, Kim, and he said hello. And then you went and ordered your drink, and everybody started talking, and Kim just went on sitting there in the back table. He didn't even join us. He didn't get up and join the party. He just sat in the back. On the other hand, I think he listened very, very carefully to everything we were saying, because one of the great mysteries of Kim was that he never went to a press conference or anything like that. You know, if some VIP arrived, Kim was not there. But every Sunday in The Observer, frequently on the front page, this brilliant written account from H.A.R. Philby, Beirut. And we always wondered where he did it and how he got the information, because he never seemed to move from the bar.
In fact, Philby's main base was the Normandy Hotel. And it was here, late in 1958, that a KGB agent finally made contact again. Philby said later that he felt his heart pounding with excitement as he realized he was back in the spying business. But behind his cover story, there were glimpses of turmoil inside.
At the end of a long evening, my wife was sitting next to him in Joe's bar, actually, and she said, were you the third man? And he said, my dear, if you had a great friend and you knew that you had some information about him that you could get him into enormous trouble, what would you do? I always valued friendship more than isms. It was a sort of confession in a way. But in fact, in a way, it wasn't a confession, because he was really more interested in isms than loyalty.
In 1960, the British Embassy moved into a new building on the Corniche.
Well, this would be the view that the British ambassador would have had in those days. Beautiful.
Patrick Seal had just joined the press corps as Philby's backup on The Observer.
I think, in retrospect, I can say that he was trying to ingratiate himself with the British authorities and persuade people, particularly in the intelligence service, that he was really, had been falsely accused, that he was totally loyal, and that, I think, was his ambition.
I think there was a certain resentment that he'd been parachuted in, they felt, to the corps, you know, rather than having earned his stripes on the way up, because he had been parachuted in by the Friends.
Alan Munro, standing here behind the ambassador, was then press attaché at the embassy.
Oddly enough, some years later, I found the card which Kim Philby had given me, H.A.R. Philby, The Observer, The Economist, Hotel Normandy, Beirut. And on the back, there he's written this map, Rue Cantari and so on, and how to find his block of flats.
Well, this is Rue Cantari today, and up there, on the 5th floor, the flat where Philby lived.
It was toward the end of the Christian Quarter, overlooking the port. Quite a sensational view of Beirut from there. It was very comfortable and attractive and a good place for parties, really.
Parties. Philby was famously charming when they started, often drunk by the time they ended.
We all said, you know, what Kim needs to do is to find a really nice girl who'll keep him on the straight and narrow. And who he found was Eleanor, who had been the wife of Sam Brewer of the New York Times, and who was the only woman in Beirut who drank much more than Kim did.
They loved going down to the beach, often with a bag full of little tiny bottles of different sorts of drink, which they would consume and then struggle to come up from the beach, often falling down, bruising themselves.
It was hard to remember that back in England, he still had a wife and 5 children. One afternoon, Dick and Moira Beeston met him out shopping.
I've had great news there. He said, come and we must celebrate. Come and have a drink at the Normandy. And then he produced this cable saying his wife had died. We were very shocked about that. And he said, well, it was the best thing for everybody. He said, you know, she's been terribly ill and hurting herself, and, you know, it was the best way out for everyone.
Her ungrieving husband returned to normal business and soon married Eleanor.
For a few months or so, they seemed very much in love and not drinking very much and rather charming. And then gradually it deteriorated, and they both used to drink enormously.
Yes, I think that is certainly true. Definitely, yes. Yes, indeed. Yes. They were well suited on that line, yes, certainly.
Lorraine Copeland was Eleanor's best friend in Beirut. She was married to a man called Miles Copeland, who did freelance work for the CIA.
This brings it all back. It was a round of parties. We lived the la vie diplomatique, and we lived a very pleasant life.
Her son, also called Miles, was then at school in Beirut. The Philbys were often guests at his parents' house.
Philbys were always there, and he was always drunk and always stuttering. And I remember saying once to my father, why are we always with the Philbys? And he said, shut up. He then told me later on why I should have shut up is because he was told by the CIA, look, we don't trust this guy. Since you're in Beirut, keep an eye on him. And it turns out the best way to keep an eye on Kim Philby was invite him to all the parties.
At this point, a man called Nicholas Elliott took over as MI6 chief in Beirut. Years later, he would make, for a spy, a rare appearance on television to talk about his work.
I got involved in this sort of work before the war, And I think one of the attractions, from my point of view, was personally, of course, one felt it was worthwhile. And secondly, as such, it was a very pleasant atmosphere in which to work, and an enormously high proportion of one's colleagues, male and female, were personal friends.
Not least Kim Philby, whose charmed Mediterranean life Elliot had done much to engineer. And once in Beirut, he continued to favor him.
I remember the head of the MI6 station coming to see me to say, I just want to tell you about one of the correspondents here, a very senior one. His name is Kim Philby, and he reports for The Observer and for The Economist, and I just want to let you know he used to be one of us, and you can trust him with information. And so I did.
And who was that?
Who was the head of station? The head of station was Nicholas Elliot.
Elliot had been to Eton and Cambridge, but he wore his expensive education lightly.
I went one day to his flat for lunch. Vast flat, very much like an ambassadorial setup. But he was not a man whom people took very seriously, perhaps mistakenly so. He was very fond of telling rather risque jokes. And at lunch, he was full of these stories, and he gave the impression of a man who simply liked to enjoy himself.
For 2 years, Philby was in clover. But just as Elliot's tour of duty in Beirut was coming to an end, a conversation took place 130 miles south in Israel, which would turn Philby's life upside down.
Philby became the focus of attention in a relatively casual conversation between Victor Rothschild, who had been an MI5 officer during the Second World War, and a woman called Flora Solomon, at a drinks party in Tel Aviv.
This is the marriage certificate of Kim Philby to his recently deceased wife, Aileen. Who was the witness? Flora Solomon.
Flora Solomon complained about some articles that had been written by Kim Philby in The Observer. She felt that they were anti-Zionist, and she remarked to Victor Rothschild that this was pretty rich coming from Kim Philby, on the basis that Philby had in fact approached her at the beginning of the war and had pitched her to join the Comintern, to, quote, work for peace.
Chapman Pincher, Harry to his friends, is approaching 100 and a legend among spy-hunting journalists. He knew Victor Rothschild well and says Flora actually went even further.
She said, look, there's something I must tell you. I know that Philby was a spy, and I've known a long time, it's been on my conscience. But I'd like you to know that I know that he was working for the KGB. That's what she said.
The popular myth about the elite secret services was that great decisions were taken over games of billiards in the clubs of London. All the main players in the drama that followed came from this world.
Victor Rothschild left the security service, but he was still in very close contact with several senior MI5 officers, including Dick White, and he reported to Dick White that this conversation had taken place.
By then, White, Philby's MI5 adversary in 1951, had been transferred to the top job at MI6.
So Dick and Hollis, who was then the head of MI5, got their heads together and decided they'd have to do something. But what they would do, and this thing I think is terrible because it's happened so often, they decided under no circumstances would he be prosecuted in any way, whatever he might admit. But in return for a confession, they would give him total immunity, not only from prosecution, but from publicity. In other words, the whole thing would be completely hushed up.
But there were tensions between the two branches of British intelligence. SIS, as MI6 is officially called, is now over there across the Thames. The normal procedure was for them to hand a matter like this over to MI5, the spy-catching service just down the road. Accordingly, MI5 were preparing one of their top interrogators for the confrontation.
Arthur Martin was briefed and ready to go, and at that 11th hour, Dick White decided that it should be an SIS officer who should make the approach to Kim Philby, not Arthur Martin.
What had happened, it seems, is that Nicholas Elliott had returned from Beirut and got wind of what was going on. He put the case to his boss that he should be the person sent to confront Philby. Surprisingly, White agreed.
His justification for this was that Arthur Martin would not really cut the mustard. At the end of the Second World War, he'd been an NCO. He had never risen above the rank of sergeant. And in a very class-conscious world, Dick White, who had ended up with the rank of brigadier, felt very strongly that Arthur would not impress Kim Philby.
So they told Elliott, and Elliott confirmed this to me, that he had to say to Philby that they knew he had ceased to spy in 1949. And the reason for that was that that was just before Philby had gone to America. So if they could get a statement from him saying he'd ceased to spy in 1949, the Americans could be assured that he'd not given away any of their secrets, because he'd ceased to be a spy before he went to Washington.
So Elliott arrived back in Beirut to confront Philby. But when? The usual story is that he came back in January '63. But according to Eleanor Philby, in her book about these events, Elliott actually came back in December, just before Christmas. He checked into a discreet hotel where he wouldn't be recognized and took Kim and herself out to an expensive meal. There was the usual fund of doubtful jokes from Elliott, she says, but the gaiety was false. And whatever was said privately between them made Kim so depressed that he wouldn't go out over Christmas, and led to him drinking so much that he cracked his head open on a radiator in their bathroom on New Year's Day.
What I saw was a man who I thought was simply a drunk. He'd fallen down, he was wounded, his head, he had a wound somewhere on his head, I think. He was weeping quite substantially. I'd never seen a grown man weep as much as he did. He was clearly frightened. I thought it was just drunkenness. It was only later that I understood that he was under tremendous pressure and was worried that the Russians would not save him in time.
So if the official story is right, and the actual confrontation with Elliott was in mid-January, did Elliott make an extra trip to warn his friend? Or did Eleanor get it wrong? Or did someone else deliver the news which ruined the Philbys' Christmas? Here's one possible answer.
In December of 1962, I went to a reception given by my ambassador, Moore Crosswaite, and one of the guests there, indeed I think the principal guest, was Sir Anthony Blunt, who had apparently come out to Beirut in a rather unlikely quest for a frog orchid.
But the idea, I think, is that
Blunt was then keeper of the Queen's pictures. Within 18 months, he would secretly confess to being one of the Cambridge spies, recruited at the same time as Kim Philby. But in December 1962, he was still a close friend of Victor Rothschild, whom he'd known since their Cambridge days. And both of them were friends of Dick White.
The reception was, I think, given in his honor. He seemed perfectly relaxed and was obviously off to do a bit of hiking in the hills. Just what had brought him out at the time, in reality, I couldn't say.
Could it really have been that frog orchid? I went to see André Schuttmann, a world orchid specialist.
Here is the orchid library. There are so many orchids that they have their own library in Kew, with thousands of books and journals. We have here a book, Orchids of Britain and Ireland, and here we have the frog orchid, relatively common throughout Britain. As you can see, all the green.
And you, as an expert, would say that the frog orchids simply don't grow in...
No, they don't grow in Lebanon. There's a book about orchids of Lebanon. There's an index, so it's not in Lebanon. It's not in Lebanon.
So you're confident that if Anthony Blunt went to Lebanon, it would not have been to see a frog orchid?
Definitely not, no. That would be clearly a lie. That can't be true.
This is the ambassador's residence where Blunt was staying as a private guest. Philby's flat was a short walk away. There's no independent evidence that they met, but...
It seems inconceivable to me that Blunt would have travelled to Beirut at that time without having seen Philby, knowing that they were old friends and with many friends in common.
Had Blunt picked up a clue in something those friends had said and come to warn his fellow spy? In early January, Philby got a call from the embassy. They said they wanted him to come to a private flat to meet the new local head of MI6, skiing fanatic Peter Lunn.
When he arrived there, who should it be?
Not Peter Lunn.
But Nicholas Elliot. According to Nicholas, his first words were, "I thought it might be you, Nicholas."
In the next room, a tape had been set running to record the long-awaited confession.
Nicholas said to him, "We've got absolutely top-flight information. You were a spy, you betrayed us all, you betrayed me, your old pal, and one thing and another. But what we are prepared to do, in return for a confession that you did do that, and of course ceased to spy in 1949, we will guarantee you immunity from prosecution and publicity."
His reaction was that he would, if Nicholas Elliot came back the next day, he would prepare a document in which he would set out the precise position.
There is still no public record of this encounter, but the consensus of leaks and briefings is that Elliot and Philby then had further meetings, culminating in Philby handing over a written confession.
Exactly what was in it I was never told, but it wasn't very long. But it did include the important fact that he had ceased to spy in 1949, which they were able to tell the Americans.
Elliot filed a report to London and flew on to Africa, telling Lunn that Philby was now ready to cooperate and didn't need special surveillance.
The hope was that he would either come back to London and make himself available for interview, or alternatively, he would remain in Beirut, and again, MI5 would be able to interview him at length, and he would in effect become an asset of the intelligence community.
On that basis, Peter Lunn made an arrangement to see Philby later and went off skiing in the mountains. Five days later, a winter storm struck Beirut. During the afternoon, Philby had left the flat to meet his KGB contact. He and Eleanor had been invited to dinner that evening by friends from the British Embassy. As the hours slipped by, Kim phoned to say he'd meet her at the party. Malcolm Davidson was one of the other guests.
It was all like a sort of mansion block in West Kensington. It was long, dark corridors with rooms off either side and sort of stained glass windows. And I remember it quite clearly, going right through and then finding the dining room set at the end there. And we were sort of talking and drinking and hanging about, and it turns out that the spare girl there was Eleanor Philby, waiting for her husband.
The first thought that crossed our minds was that he had been too heavy with the drink, and therefore he'd just sort of collapsed on the street corner and somebody had taken him to hospital
Eventually people think he's always late, and it's ridiculous, we'll start without him.
I remember feeling upset for Eleanor because she was obviously very upset herself. And I suppose she must have thought that something serious had happened.
What had happened was that Kim Philby had gone down to the port with a KGB guide and by morning was on a Russian freighter bound for the Soviet Union. Some things don't change much in Moscow. The victory over Hitler was fresher in the mind then, the power of the state unarguable. Maybe Philby felt he was on the right side of history, but it was not a hero's welcome he was given.
He arrived in Moscow, what he described as going home, to find that he was regarded with some suspicion, that everything that he'd worked for had seemed, on second thoughts by the Russians, too good to be true. I mean, could British intelligence really be so slack that they allowed so much information to escape and be handed over to the Russians? It was just impossible to believe.
He was given an apartment just a few hundred meters from where the parade rolled by, but it was more like house arrest than freedom. Mikhail Lyubimov was a KGB officer who became a good friend of Philby's.
Our service expected the British may kill him anytime, even in Moscow, even in the Red Square, because at that time there was a magnified fear of killings, because under Stalin the traitors were killed.
Stalin the man was long gone, but Stalin the mindset was alive and well. The KGB didn't breathe a word about Philby's arrival. The British government line, in letters from the ambassador in Beirut, was that they didn't know where Philby was.
This is possible he was either on a trip for journalistic purposes or, being of somewhat irregular habits, he'd gone off on a lost weekend.
It was March before the newspapers even mentioned his absence.
We had the papers in bed, and there's a little column, tiny little bit at the bottom of the Observer saying our reporter's missing. I suppose, in a way, one sort of half believed that he had gone, you know, to Moscow. I mean, what else was he doing?
In July, some 5 months after his disappearance, the truth came out.
It's quite difficult when it's your father. It took me a long time to sort of really come to terms with the idea that other people hated him. And, you know, I thought, well, you know, he's a hero to the Russians.
Not exactly. Philby found he was not even allowed to enter KGB headquarters, nor did he have any rank in the organization he had served so long.
No agent can be trusted completely. He had to be checked all the time. And Kim, still, though he was a very valuable agent and the pride of the Soviet intelligence, still his flat was controlled. He was forbidden to meet foreigners. Of course, nobody was afraid that he was going to spy for the Brits again. They were afraid that he might declare that he wants to go back. I think this is the main menace, the main threat.
To reduce that threat, they allowed his family to come and see him. Visiting Russia was rare in those days.
You'd go to the embassy and say, there's a visa being arranged for me by my father. Where does he live? I don't know. What does he do? I don't know. And this woman was, on one occasion, getting very ratty. So I leant forward, looking round quite carefully, and I said, he works for the KGB. She scuttled off, and we got our visa.
Josephine came fairly regularly. But the relationship with Eleanor So fond in Beirut, withered in the gloom of the Soviet Union.
I think her stay in Russia was not a success. For one thing, she never learnt enough Russian even to be able to read the names of metro stations. I think she became a sort of burden to him.
I don't really blame her for not liking it, and I think she was absolutely horrified at what Dad had done, and I don't think she had had any clue, because otherwise I think she could have coped with it better.
His university friend Guy Burgess had died a few months after Philby's arrival. He was never allowed to see him again. A morose Donald MacLean and his wife Melinda were practically the limit of their social circle. The once loved Eleanor simply didn't fit in.
He, in fact, I think, wanted to get rid of her, and I think started an affair with Melinda MacLean, which eventually, of course, drove her out.
She once said, "What's more important, me or the party?" And he said, "Don't be silly, the party." And that did not go down well. And probably, actually, he might have said that to all of us, too. That's the way he thought.
Nicholas Elliott's brief trip to Beirut had turned decidedly septic. The public were asking, if Philby was a traitor, why hadn't he been arrested? As with everything else, there were theories, not answers.
I'm convinced that this was a plot by White, Hollis, and anybody else, including Nicholas, who might be interested, to induce Philby to get the hell out of it. Because the last thing they wanted was any kind of trial in England.
There were people who said this is a disaster, you know, and it's, we ought to be ashamed of ourselves letting him go like that. We should have roped him in a lot earlier and put him in prison where he belongs. But I think an awful lot of people, certainly I, thought, you know, well, thank God he's buggered off. We shan't be troubled with him again.
But if that was a deliberate plan, some key people don't seem to have been party to it.
The whole defection is a catastrophe. The Security Service emphatically had never contemplated that Philby would take that course of action. That was simply not on the agenda.
Could be just incompetence. Never underrate that possibility.
To MI5, incompetence had been the hallmark of the whole operation.
There was great frustration that this was the Secret Intelligence Service who had taken over quite a sophisticated, detailed operation and planned interview, and that they bungled it.
In the first place, if there had been a confession, the recording of it was useless.
Since none of them were technicians, and because it was a very hot day, the window had been left open, and when the recording was played back,
the noise of the traffic outside was so great, you couldn't hear a thing on it. He was a great fellow for making a hash of everything, but always getting away with it.
And the typewritten confession Elliot got from Philby caused even more problems.
When that document was examined in London, it became clear that it was worthless. But it was very skillfully crafted, and the view was that this was not a spontaneous reaction to an offer of immunity, that it had been built up over quite a long period, but a lot of thought and planning had gone into it.
By, of course, the KGB.
All this was coordinated with Russians. It was a game played by Philby with Elliot and nothing else. It was a game to get as much information as possible to take a right decision.
Whether that's just KGB propaganda or not, it was pretty much the conclusion that the bosses in London came to.
This was fairly good evidence that Kim Philby had been expecting an immunity from prosecution, and that the approach that had been made by Nicholas Elliott had been anticipated because of a tip-off.
The whole episode was a lethal blow to the values and attitudes which had underpinned the Secret Intelligence Service for more than a generation. Whoever had warned Philby in advance, it was clear that good breeding and good manners were no guarantee of loyalty to the nation.
The entire case of the Cambridge spies was reopened as a major investigation, and there was a pursuit of a likely mole within MI5.
It infected SIS, the whole British intelligence establishment, with the paranoia. In fact, they devoted about the next 20 years to the wasteful pursuit of fellow officers that they considered might be spies, might be the Philby mold.
The Philby mould was now a sorry sight. Isolated, unemployed and unhappy, he might just as well have been in jail. What perked him up was another embarrassment to the British.
Blake was completely missing. There was a search immediately with police dogs. Prison officers examined the wall and found a nylon ladder.
4 years before, the man who'd escaped had been studying Arabic at the so-called School for Spies. Like Philby, George Blake was a KGB agent who'd got a job inside British intelligence. No immunity offer for him, he was lured back to London, put on trial, and sentenced to 42 years in jail. In Moscow, the two spies became friends. By then, Philby was said to be drinking himself towards death.
Though he was under protection of our directorate, they couldn't prevent him from drinking. And they decided to marry him. Well, and Blake asked his wife, Ida, to get Kim acquainted to some good girl. And by some chance, Ida was a friend of Rufina.
Philby was invited to join Rufina on a blind date to go to an ice dancing show at the Luzhniki Stadium. Drink hadn't dulled his taste for romance.
And we came to Luzhniki, me and Ida first, chatted, and then months after them. And Kim told me afterwards, in those seconds, I decided that I will marry you.
And to tell you frankly, Rufina is a very charming, very beautiful, and very clever woman who, by the way, knew English quite well to be a wife.
This flat became, he said, his island on the 6th floor. It's still stuffed with relics of an Englishman in exile.
This shelf is all about him. English books written about the Cambridge Five and so on. Obviously very fond of Dick Francis, and up there, P.G. Wood has a complete collection, it looks.
The radio was his lifeline as he settled into the routines of a domestic life.
This is London Court.
But one thing didn't change much.
Time for drink at 6 o'clock. No, one portion, okay? Second portion, it was, I feel that. Yeah? Third, it was bad. And for me, it was so sad to look, man, it's just been clear, nice. It just became, it's very almost idiot, you know, just it was difficult.
His children told me he missed kippers, marmalade, English mustard and good whiskey.
I remember this program, you like, sing something simple. It was so wonderful music and so interesting, and fun. I remember it still.
Rufina told me how he hated her leaving his sight, even to go and see friends for the afternoon.
He can see me when I go. He stays always like this. And when I come back, also that's light here, he's waiting.
He became almost childishly devoted to her, the hardened master spy in need of love.
Boychik, Yaganka, he is Boychik. I have gone to the post here, to the post office, because you are so kindsky. And I want to do something nice for you.
His isolated existence meant that the Moscow out there was not something he saw too much of. But he wasn't blind to the failures of the cause he'd committed his life to.
He saw that the life here was not a paradise at all. He saw the secretiveness of life. He saw the power of the KGB. He saw the absence of the freedom.
Solzhenitsyn spent much of his first day in banishment under siege by the world's press.
I remember after a good bottle of scotch, he said, "Why are you expelling Solzhenitsyn from Russia?" I told him, "Look, Kim, I'm not responsible for this." "No," he said, "you are responsible. You are responsible for this too, and I'm responsible too." So he was disillusioned, of course.
As the years rolled by, he did venture out more often and went on holidays around the Soviet Empire. But contact with the life he'd left behind was a rare treat.
My wife spotted him. We were just sitting down, and she spotted him sitting with his wife just across from us. I went up to him in the first interval, and he I tapped him on the shoulder, and he switched around, and he said, "As I live and breathe, Dick Beeston and Moira," that sort of, I always remember that phrase, and immediately looked delighted to see us. Kim said, "How do you like it here?" I said, "Oh, we've been here 6 months, having a very difficult time." He said, 6 months? I've been here, I think it was 16 years.
The uncomfortable truth for Philby was that his value to Russia was more symbolic than personal. KGB suspicion faded. They listened occasionally to his advice about the workings of British society. But what mattered much more to them was that this old man was a living example of a signal victory over the West at a time when the skids were under the socialist dream. A biography of Philby was published recently in a Russian series called The Lives of Remarkable People. It was written by a trusted journalist called Nikolai Dolgopolov.
He's here with Markus Wolf from Germany.
He never met Philby, but came to this verdict.
He was a kind of an icon, especially, well, difficult field of human activity called intelligence. Maybe he was one of the greatest and remained one of the greatest because of his 100% devotion to the country.
Nevertheless, it was 14 years before the KGB allowed that icon even to visit the secret center of their foreign intelligence service. His job that day, to give a masterclass to the assembled spies on how to survive in the field.
He started the whole thing in a very British way, with a joke.
That he'd been to many, many intelligence services in the world.
And for the first time, he got to his own.
He had a tip for them about interrogations. If ever you get hauled in, whatever the evidence, never admit any connection with Soviet intelligence and never sign a document implicating yourself. So was that a joke too, telling them to do precisely the opposite of what he'd done in Beirut? Or was it a message to the friends in MI6? Once the news about his defection was public, they'd started leaking the confession story to take the curse off letting him go. But years later, Elliot may have let a different cat out of the bag. This was the question he was asked, and this was his answer.
Well, gentlemen, the circumstantial evidence against me is very strong. I know one thing you don't know. I am not and never have been a KGB agent. So there's no point in talking about the matter anymore. And provided the person keeps his or her nerve, they will be all right. George Blake lost his nerve at the last moment.
And that's what gave him away.
That's what gave him away. Kim Philby didn't lose his nerve when he was interrogated in 1951.
But Elliot hadn't attended the 51 interrogation. Was he reliving his own encounter in Beirut until he remembered the official line?
Philby didn't lose his nerve when he was interrogated in 1951.
It's not surprising we can't be sure. Spies of all stripes shield the truth with lies. Philby's own version was evasive. Probably he did give Elliot something. But what?
One of the mysteries of the Beirut confrontation.
50 years have passed, and still they keep it secret.
It's very deeply embarrassing. It's only human beings. You can't expect them to announce that they made fools of themselves for so long.
Everything that happened so long ago that it's time that it was told, and the lessons learned.
But don't bank on it. One unglamorous possibility is that the evidence, embarrassing or not, no longer exists.
I think that that's perfectly possible. There is a common complaint from the very few people who are aware of what is in SIS's registry. The common complaint is there's nothing there.
But there is a bigger barrier. Spies may have good causes, but few things they do could be called good. They want to know our secrets, but don't want us to know theirs. Ever.
What the Secret Intelligence Service does, frankly, is employ case officers who are skilled at persuading people to betray their family, their friends, their nationality. And therefore, if you wish to continue in the clandestine information collection business, you're going to have to say some material is never going to be disclosed.
In death, the KGB piled on the praise for the man they had persuaded to betray his country. There was George Blake among the stream of top KGB officers, as the Englishman they'd once left to drink himself close to oblivion was recast as a hero of the dying Soviet Union.
We were sort of in a pew, as it were, and all the sort of mourners were going round and round, or the people in Moscow paying homage. It was a horrific occasion, I found that. Well, it was an open coffin. I mean, you know, it was... Ooh. It's just not my scene at all. I just can't bear that. I loved him dearly, but I wasn't going to kiss his body.
He was a romantic. He was a romantic. He really believed in Marx. Not officially like Brezhnev, for instance, were Marxists and so on. But he really, it was part of his life. And he fought for communism all his life, since Cambridge.
Suddenly, these four men in gumboots, dungarees, and big brown aprons came up with their hammers and nails and nailed the coffin down. And he was buried, and then they had a gun salute. Yeah. And that was quite special. You know, that end bit was the best bit as far as we were concerned.
He still divides opinion. Does his hatred of fascism in the 30s excuse the betrayal of his countrymen, or lessen the blame for deaths he may have caused?
He was a British citizen, and he betrayed British secrets. However marvellous he thought the reason was, it still doesn't excuse them in the law. So he was, by proper definition, a traitor, and there's no other way of describing it.
I think he was sort of almost two people in a strange way. He did actually feel quite strongly about friendships on one side, and on the other side, of course, he was a sort of desperate traitor who would betray his family or his friends if necessary.
He said to betray, you have to first belong. And I didn't belong, I never belonged. And if people, I was a straight penetration agent, and he said, and if the other side, in other words, the British, were foolish enough to believe my spiel, then that's on them. It was their failure, not mine.
I ended up at the place where he's buried, crammed in among soldiers and patriots.
They all have their titles and their uniforms, and they seem to have flowers on Memorial Day. But when you get to Kim Philby's, it does have flowers. It's a little tired. But no title, no description, just his name.
He was just Dad. In a way, he's always been just my father. We all loved him enormously.
What is the question you've never asked him you wished you had?
I don't think, I couldn't actually say, you know, why did you do it?